everybody! Today we will be memorizing drug names by writing and reviewing. So these are the first 50 drug names out of 200. Please don't forget to subscribe and write me a comment on how I can improve my videos so that it makes it more easier and fun for you to learn and memorize drug names. So without further ado, let's get started. The first is Lipitor. Its generic is atorvastatin and it's used for cholesterol. Second is Synthroid. Its generic is levothyroxine and it's used for hypothyroidism. Third is Norvasc. Its generic is amlodipine and it's used for hypertension. Fourth is Crestor. Its generic is rosuvastatin and it's used for cholesterol. Fifth is Vesotec. Its generic is enalapril and it's used for hypertension. Sixth is Ventolin. Its generic is salbutamol and it's used for asthma or COPD. Seventh is Effexor. Its generic is venlafaxine and it's used for depression and anxiety. Eighth is Lasix. Its generic is furosemide and it's used for edema or swelling. Ninth is Seroquel. Its generic is quetiapine and it's used for schizophrenia. 10th is Pentalog. Its generic is pantoprazole and it's used for GERD. So the 11th is Nexium. Its generic is esomeprazole and it's used for GERD. 12th is Apohydro and its generic is hydrochlorothiazide and it's used for hypertension. 13th is Adalat XL. Its generic is nifedipine and it's used for hypertension. 14th is Actonel. Its generic is risitronate and it's used for osteoporosis. 15th is Plavix and its generic is clopidogrel and it's used for heart attack or stroke. 16th is Tylenol number 3. Its generic is acetaminophen, caffeine, and 30 mg codeine and it's prescribed for pain. 17th is Ativan. Its generic is lorazepam and it's used for anxiety. 18th is Amoxil. Its generic is amoxicillin and it's used for bacterial infections. 19th is Elavil. Its generic is amitriptyline and it's used for depression and anxiety. 20th is Prevacid. Its generic is lansoprazole and it's used for GERD. So 21st is Celebrex. Its generic is celecoxib and it's used for inflammation. 22nd is Flovent. Its generic is fluticasone and it's used for asthma. 23rd is Betalog. Its generic is metoprolol and it's used for hypertension. 24th is Avapro. Generic is irbesartan and it's used for hypertension. 25th is Apolactulose. Its generic is lactulose and it's used for constipation. 26th is Coles. Its generic is docusate sodium and it's used for constipation. 27th is Zantac. Its generic is ranitidine and it's used for GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. 28th is Glucophage. Its generic is metformin and it's used for type 2 diabetes. 29th is Dilantin. Its generic is phenytoin and it's used for seizures. 30th is Motilium. Its generic is domperidone and it's used for nausea and vomiting. So 31st is Risperdal. Its generic is risperidone and it's used for antipsychotic disorders. 32 is Novosen. Its generic is acetylsalicylic acid and it's used for pain, fever, and inflammation. 33rd is Losec. Its generic is omeprazole and it's used for GERD. 34th is Depakote. Its generic is valproic acid and it's used for bipolar disorder. 35th is Celexa. Its generic is citalopram and it's used for depression. 36th is Nitroder patch. Its generic is nitroglycerin and it's used for angina or chest pain. 37th is Deserel. Its generic is trazodone and it's used for depression. 38th is Diabeta. Its generic is glyburide and it's used for type 2 diabetes. 39th is Loke. Its generic is potassium chloride and it's used for potassium deficiency. 40 is Periet. Its generic is Rapazole and it's used for GERD. 41st is Aricept. Its generic is Donepezil and it's used for dementia. 42nd is Toloxin. Its generic is Digoxin and it's used for arrhythmia. 43rd is Deprexa. Its generic is olanzapine and it's used for psychotic disorders. 44th is Altace. Its generic is Ramipril and it's used for hypertension. 45th is Coumadin. Its generic is Warfarin and it's used for blood clots. 46th is Paxil. Its generic is Paroxetine and it's used for anxiety disorders. 47th is Tegretol. Its generic is Carbamazepine and it's used for seizures. 48th is Vinpred. Its generic is Prednisone and it's used for arthritis. 49th is Cerax. Its generic is Oxazepam and it's used for anxiety. 50 is Endocet. Its generic is acetaminophen and oxycodone and it's used for opioid analgesic. Hello everybody, we will be memorizing drug names by writing and reviewing. So these are the second set of 50 drug names out of 200. Please don't forget to subscribe and write me a comment on how I can improve my videos so that it makes it more easier and fun for you to learn and memorize. So without further ado, let's get started. The 51st is Tenormin. Its generic is atenolol and it's used for hypertension. 52 is Ditropan. Its generic is oxybutinin and it's used for overactive bladder. 53 is Cipralex. Its generic is escitalopram and it's used for depression. 54th is Lyrica. Its generic is pregabalin and it's used for epilepsy. 55 is Nasonex. Its generic is mometasone and it's used for nasal congestion. 56 is Azetrol. Its generic is azitamib and it's used for cholesterol. 57 is Xyloprim. Its generic is allopurinol and it's used for kidney stones. 58 is Spiriva. Its generic is tiotropium and it's used for COPD. 59th is Atacan. Its generic is candesartan and it's used for hypertension. 60 is Alise. Its generic is levonorgestrel and ethinyl estradiol and it's used for contraception and birth control. So 61st is Wellbutrin. Its generic is bupropion and it's used for depression. 62nd is D-Tabs. Its generic is cholecalciferol and it's used for vitamin D deficiency. 63rd is Micardis. Its generic is telmisartan and it's used for hypertension. 64th is Symbicort. Its generic is budesonide and formoterol and it's used for asthma and COPD. 65th is Yasmin. Its generic is drospirenone and ethinyl estradiol and it's used for contraception. 66th is Aleve. Its generic is naproxen and it's used for pain, inflammation and joint stiffness. 67th is Flomax. Its generic is tamsulosin and it's used for BPH. 68th is Advair Discus. Its generic is salmeterol and fluticasone and it's used for asthma and COPD. 69th is Cozar. Its generic is losartan and it's used for hypertension. 70 is Dimicron. Its generic is glycoside and it's used for type 2 diabetes. So 71st is Diovan. Its generic is valsartan and it's used for hypertension. 72 is Estrace. Its generic is estradiol and it's used for symptoms of menopause. 73 is Arthrotec. Its generic is misoprostol and diclofenac and it's used for arthritis. 74 is Cymbalta. Its generic is duloxetine and it's used for depression. 75 is Biaxin. Its generic is clarithromycin and it's used for bacterial infections. 76 is Tiazec. Its generic is diltiazem and it's used for angina and hypertension. 77 is Tricycline. Its generic is norgestimate and ethinyl estradiol, and it's used for contraception. 78 is Cipro, and its generic is ciprofloxacin, and it's used for bacterial infections. 79 is Covercel, its generic is Perindrobel, and it's used for hypertension. 80 is Zithromax, its generic is azithromycin, and it's used for bacterial infections. So 81st is Neurontin, its generic is gabapentin, and it's used for seizures. 82nd is Concerta, its generic is methylphenidate, and it's used for ADHD. 83rd is Voltaren, its generic is diclofenac, and it's used for inflammation and pain. 84th is Dilaudid, its generic is hydromorphone, and it's used as opioid analgesic. 85th is Keflex, its generic is cephalexin, and it's used for bacterial infections. 86th is Lipidil, its generic is fenofibrate, and it's used for cholesterol. 87th is Betaderm, its generic is betamethasone, and it's used for skin conditions like eczema. 88th is Prevacol, its generic is Prevastatin, and it's used for cholesterol. 89th is Flaxeril, its generic is cyclobenzaprine, and it's used as muscle relaxant. 90th is Evolid, its generic is hydrochlorothiazide and irbesartan, and it's used for hypertension. 91st is Prinival, its generic is lisinopril, and it's used for hypertension. 92 is Remeron, its generic is mirtazapine, and it's used for depression. 93rd is Pelafair, its generic is ferrous fumarate, and it's used for iron deficiency. 94th is Amislon, its generic is morphine, and it's used as opioid analgesic. 95th is Prozac, its generic is fluoxetine, and it's used for depression. 96th is Imovane, its generic is Zopiclone, and it's used for insomnia. 97th is Fosamax, its generic is alendronate, and it's used for osteoporosis. 98th is Primarin, its generic is conjugated estrogen, and it's used for symptoms of menopause. 99 is Milk of Magnesia, and its generic is magnesium hydroxide, and it's used for constipation. 100 is Metamucil, its generic is Thallium, and it's used for constipation. Hello everybody, so these are the third set of 50 drug names out of 200. Please don't forget to subscribe and write me a comment on how I can improve my videos so that it makes it more easier for you to memorize and learn drug names. So without further ado, let's get started. 101 is Pro-Air HFA, its generic is albuterol, and it's used for asthma and COPD. Sorry, mistake, asthma is MA. 102 is Augmentin, its generic is amoxicillin and clavulanate, and it's used for bacterial infections. 103 is Combivent, its generic is albuterol and ipratropium, and it's used for COPD. 104 is Diflucan, its generic is fluconazole, and it's used for fungal and yeast infections. 105 is Singular, its generic is Montelukast, and it's used for asthma. 106 is Septra, its generic is sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim, and it's used for bacterial infections. 107 is Mobic, its generic is Meloxicam, and it's used for rheumatoid arthritis. 108 is Lidoderm, its generic is lidocaine, and it's used as anesthesia. 109 is Ultram, its generic is Tramadol, and it's used for pain. 110 is Duragesic, its generic is fentanyl transdermal, and it's used as opioid analgesic. 111 is Xanax, its generic is alprazolam, and it's used for anxiety. 112 is Rivotril, its generic is clonazepam, and it's used for epilepsy. 113 is Topamax, its generic is Topiramate, and it's used for seizures. 114 is Keppra, its generic is levetiracetam, and it's used for epilepsy. 115 is Abilify. Its generic is aripiprazole and it's used for schizophrenia. 116 is Zoloft. Its generic is sertraline and it's used for depression. 117 is Pristiq. Its generic is desvenlafaxine and it's used for depression. 118 is Lentus. Its generic is glargine insulin and it's used for type 2 diabetes. 119 is Humalog. Its generic is Lispro insulin and it's used for diabetes. 120 is Novolog. Its generic is Aspart insulin and it's used for diabetes. 121 is Actos. Its generic is pioglitazone and it's used for diabetes. 122 is Januvia. Its generic is sitagliptin and it's used for diabetes. 123 is Atarax. Its generic is hydroxyzine and it's used for allergies. 124 is Rheumatrax. Its generic is methotrexate and it's used for rheumatoid arthritis. 125 is Inder. Its generic is isosorbide mononitrate and it's used for angina or chest pain. 126 is Nitrostat. Its generic is nitroglycerin and it's used for angina or chest pain. 127 is Lyrica. Its generic is pregabalin and it's used for epilepsy. 128 is Mevacor. Its generic is lovastatin and it's used for cholesterol. 129 is Lopid. Its generic is Genfibrocil and it's used for cholesterol. 130 is Lotensin. Its generic is Benazepril and it's used for hypertension. 131 is Acupril. Its generic is Quinapril and it's used for hypertension. 132 is Olmetec. Its generic is Olmesartan and it's used for hypertension. 133 is Coreg. Its generic is Carvedilol and it's used for hypertension. 134 is Inderva. Its generic is Propranolol and it's used for hypertension. 135 is Monocor. Its generic is Bisoprolol and it's used for hypertension. 136 is Sectra. Its generic is Acebutolol and it's used for hypertension. 137 is Isoctin. Its generic is Verapamil and it's used for hypertension. 138 is Aldactone. Its generic is Spironolactone and it's used for hypertension. 139 is Diazide. Its generic is Triamterene and hydrochlorothiazide and it's used for hypertension. 148 is Ketapres. Its generic is Clonidine and it's used for hypertension. 141 is Omnicef. Its generic is Ceftanib and it's used for bacterial infections. 142 is Vigamox. Its generic is Moxifloxacin and it's used for bacterial infection. 143 is Nizoral. Its generic is Ketoconazole and it's used for skin conditions. 144 is Flagyl. Its generic is Metronidazole and it's used for bacterial infections. 145 is Bactroban. Its generic is Mupirocin and it's used for bacterial infections. 146 is Medrol. Its generic is Prednisolone and it's used for immune system diseases. 147 is Proscar. Its generic is Finasteride and it's used for benign prostatic hyperplasia. 148 is Hytrine. Its generic is Terazosin and it's used for BPH. 149 is Viagra. Its generic is Sildenafil and it's used for incontinence. 150 is Reglan. Its generic is metoclopramide and it's used for nausea and vomiting. So these are the last 50 set of drug names out of 200. Please don't forget to subscribe and write me a comment on how I can improve my videos so that it makes it more easier for you to memorize and learn drug names. So without further ado, let's get started. 151 is Phenergan. Its generic is Promethazine and it's used for allergies. 152 is Zofran. Its generic is Ondansetron and it's used for nausea and vomiting. 153 is Avista. Its generic is Riloxifene and it's used for osteoporosis. 154 is Detrol. Its generic is Tolterodine and it's used for overactive bladder. 155 is Champix. Its generic is Varenicline and it's used for smoking cessation. 156 is Abixa. Its generic is Mementine and it's used for Alzheimer's disease. 157 is Requip. Its generic is Ropinirole and it's used for symptoms of Parkinson's. 158 is Cogentin. Its generic is Benztropine and it's used for symptoms of Parkinson's. 159 is Xelatan. Its generic is Latanoprost and it's used for glaucoma. 160 is Cialis. Its generic is Tadalafil and it's used for incontinence. 161 is Aristocort. Its generic is triamcinolone and it's used for skin conditions. 162 is Soma. Its generic is Carisoprodol and it's used as muscle relaxant. 163 is Robaxin. Its generic is methocarbamol and it's used as muscle relaxant. 164 is Luracil. Its generic is Baclofen and it's used in muscle spasm. 165 is Ambien. Its generic is Zolpidem and it's used in insomnia. 166 is Restoril. Its generic is Temazepam and it's used in insomnia. 167 is Macrobid. Its generic is nitrofurantoin and it's used in bacterial infections. 168 is Enbisol. Its generic is benzocaine and it's used for anesthesia. 169 is Vigamox. Its generic is moxifloxacin and it's used for bacterial infections. 170 is Saftin. Its generic is Cefuroxime and it's used for bacterial infections. 171 is Tamiflu. Its generic is Oseltamivir and it's used for influenza. 172 is Canesten. Its generic is Clotrimazole and it's used for fungal infections. 173 is Colchicine. Its generic is Colchicine and it's used for gout. 174 is Clozaril. Its generic is Clozapine and it's used for schizophrenia. 175 is Valium. Its generic is Diazepam and it's used for anxiety. 176 is Avodart. Its generic is Dutasteride and it's used in BPH. 177 is Lumigan. Its generic is Bimetoprost and it's used for glaucoma. 178 is Trandate. Its generic is Labetalol and it's used for hypertension. 179 is Latuda. Its generic is Luresidone and it's used for schizophrenia. 180 is Cordaron. Its generic is Amiodarone and it's used in arrhythmia. 181 is Avendia. Its generic is Rosiglitazone and it's used for diabetes. 182 is Pepcid. Its generic is Famotidine and it's used in heartburn. 183 is Miralax. Its generic is polyethylene glycol and it's used as in constipation. 184 is Advil. Its generic is Ibuprofen and it's used for pain and inflammation. 185 is Vyvanse. Its generic is Lisdexamfetamine and it's used for ADHD. 186 is Suboxone. Its generic is buprenorphine and naloxone and it's used for narcotic addiction. 187 is Penwike. Its generic is penicillin and it's used for bacterial infections. 188 is Benadryl. Its generic is diphenhydramine and it's used in allergies. 189 is Gravol. Its generic is dimenhydrinate and it's used for nausea. 190 is Myrbetriq. Its generic is Mirabegron and it's used for overactive bladder. 191 is Zyrtec. Its generic is cetirizine and it's used in allergy symptoms. 192 is Plaquenil. Its generic is hydroxychloroquine and it's used in malaria. 193 is Anusol HC. Its generic is hydrocortisone and it's used in hemorrhoidal symptoms. 194 is Voltrax. Its generic is Valacyclovir and it's used in viral infections. 195 is Hyzar. Its generic is losartan and hydrochlorothiazide and it's used in hypertension. 196 is Xarelto. Its generic is Rivaroxaban and it's used in blood clots. 197 is Haldol. Its generic is haloperidol and it's used in psychotic disorders. 198 is Sinemet. Its generic is Levodopa carbidopa and it's used for the symptoms of Parkinson's. 199 is EpiPen. Its generic is epinephrine and it's used for severe allergic reactions. 200 is Plendil. Its generic is Felodipine and it's used in hypertension.